The supper table was set with crystal and silver that caught the candlelight like stars. And Eliza Monroe stood in the doorway watching the Beaumont family settle into their evening meal with the calm satisfaction of those who believed themselves untouchable. She had prepared every dish herself that night, her hands steady as she stirred the rich gumbo, seasoned the roasted duck, and folded delicate herbs into the cream sauce that would accompany the vegetables. The family never suspected that among those herbs were the purple berries of deadly nightshade, carefully crushed and measured with the precision of a woman who had once been New Orleans' most sought-after midwife. As Madame Beaumont raised the first spoonful to her lips, Eliza turned away, and those who claimed to have seen her face in that moment swore she was smiling. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Eliza Monroe began not in darkness but in light, in the bustling markets of New Orleans where the air smelled of chicory coffee and fresh beignets, where French and English and Spanish and African languages braided together into something uniquely their own. She had been born free in 1812. The daughter of Marie Monroe, a herbalist whose knowledge of plants and their properties had been passed down through generations stretching back to the coast of West Africa. Eliza's childhood was spent learning to distinguish healing roots from poisonous ones, understanding which leaves could bring down a fever and which flowers could ease the pain of childbirth. Her mother had been careful, methodical in her teaching, making Eliza repeat the names and uses of each plant until the knowledge became as natural as breathing. By the time Eliza reached 20 years old, she had already delivered more than 50 babies in the Creole quarters of New Orleans, her reputation spreading through word of mouth among women who trusted her gentle hands and sharp mind. She knew how to turn a breech baby, how to stop excessive bleeding, how to ease a difficult labor with tinctures made from roots she gathered herself in the bayou. The wealthy white families began requesting her services as well, impressed by her knowledge and her success rate at a time when childbirth remained one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Eliza had saved the lives of countless mothers and infants, and she took pride in her work, feeling that she was carrying on her mother's legacy in a meaningful way. Her life changed in 1836 when she met and fell in love with Joseph Crane, a free carpenter whose workshop produced the finest furniture in the French Quarter. Their meeting had been accidental, occurring at the market where Eliza was purchasing supplies and Joseph was delivering a custom armoire to a merchant. He had noticed her examining bundles of dried herbs with the careful scrutiny of someone who truly understood what they were looking at, and he struck up a conversation that began with plants and wandered through topics as varied as the weather, the politics of the city, and their shared dreams for the future. Joseph was a man of quiet strength, his hands scarred from years of working with tools but capable of incredible delicacy when shaping wood into furniture that seemed almost alive. Their courtship lasted 6 months, conducted in the spaces where free black people in New Orleans could gather without attracting too much attention or suspicion. They walked along the levee on Sunday afternoons, attended gatherings at the homes of friends, and spent long evenings talking about everything and nothing. Joseph told Eliza about his own parents, both of whom had purchased their freedom decades earlier, and who had instilled in him a fierce pride in his independence and his craft. Eliza shared stories of her mother's teachings, of the responsibility she felt to use her knowledge to help others, of the satisfaction she found in bringing new life safely into the world. They married in a small ceremony at the St. Augustine Church, the only Catholic church in New Orleans that welcomed free people of color without relegating them to separate sections or services. Eliza wore a dress of pale blue cotton that Joseph's mother had sewn for the occasion, and Joseph wore his finest suit, the one he reserved for attending church and conducting business with his wealthiest clients. The priest who married them was a Creole man who understood the particular challenges faced by free black couples in a city where freedom was always conditional, always subject to being questioned or revoked. He blessed their union and prayed that they would find peace and security in each other, knowing that the world outside would offer them little of either. For 2 years, Eliza knew happiness in a way she had never experienced before and would never know again. She continued her work as a midwife while Joseph built cribs and rocking chairs that were sold to families throughout Louisiana, his reputation for quality craftsmanship spreading by word of mouth among those who could afford custom furniture. They rented a small apartment in a building owned by another free black family, 2 rooms with a tiny kitchen and windows that looked out onto a courtyard where children played and neighbors gathered to share meals and stories. They saved their money carefully, adding coins to a jar they kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, dreaming of purchasing a small house with land where they could grow their own herbs and perhaps raise a family of their own. Eliza remembered those 2 years with painful clarity during her time of enslavement, the memories both a comfort and a torture. She would recall the way Joseph's face lit up when he came home in the evenings, the smell of sawdust that clung to his clothes, the feel of his calloused hands holding hers as they planned their future together. She remembered lazy Sunday mornings spent in bed, the luxury of having nowhere they needed to be and nothing they needed to do except enjoy each other's company. She remembered the small rituals they had developed, the way Joseph always brought her flowers from the market on Fridays, the way she always prepared his favorite meal of red beans and rice on Mondays, the way they would sit together in the evenings while he carved small wooden figures and she sorted her herbs and they talked about the children they hoped to have someday. But New Orleans in the 1830s was a city of contradictions, where freedom for black people existed on paper but could vanish like morning fog when the right person decided they wanted something you had. The Beaumont family, wealthy plantation owners who maintained a lavish townhouse in the city, had recently lost their family physician to yellow fever. Madame Celeste Beaumont, pregnant with her 4th child and paranoid about the dangers of childbirth, had heard of Eliza's skills. She demanded that Eliza attend to her throughout her pregnancy and delivery, offering payment that seemed generous at first. Eliza agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to earn enough money to finally purchase that house she and Joseph had been dreaming about. The pregnancy proceeded normally, and Eliza visited the Beaumont townhouse 3 times a week to check on Madame Beaumont's health. The house itself was a monument to excess, with imported marble floors, French wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes, and furniture that Joseph himself had crafted years before. The Beaumont family consisted of Monsieur Laurent Beaumont, a stern man with calculating eyes who made his fortune from sugarcane and the labor of more than 200 enslaved people on his plantation upriver, Madame Celeste, who spent her days orchestrating elaborate social events and demanding absolute perfection from her servants and their 3 children, Henri, Marguerite, and little Claude, who ranged in age from 9 years to 4. The delivery came on a humid August night when the air hung thick enough to swim through. Eliza worked for 14 hours straight, using every skill her mother had taught her to guide Madame Beaumont through a difficult labor. The baby, a girl they named Josephine, arrived healthy despite the complications, her strong cry filling the bedroom like a trumpet announcement. Madame Beaumont recovered well under Eliza's care, and Monsieur Beaumont seemed pleased with the outcome. Eliza expected to receive her payment and return to her normal life, attending to the various women throughout the city who depended on her services. Instead, 3 days after the delivery, 2 men arrived at the small apartment where Eliza and Joseph lived. They carried papers that Monsieur Beaumont had forged, documents claiming that Eliza was actually an enslaved woman who had been purchased by the Beaumont family. The papers were convincing, complete with fake signatures and official-looking seals. In a city where racial classification could mean the difference between freedom and bondage, where a single drop of African blood could be used to justify enslavement, the forgery was enough. The men seized Eliza despite her protests, despite Joseph's desperate attempts to fight them off, despite the neighbors who witnessed the kidnapping and did nothing because they feared the power of the Beaumont family. Joseph tried everything to get his wife back. He went to lawyers who refused to take the case. He went to the police who laughed at him. He went to the church, but even the priest could offer only prayers. The Beaumont family had connections throughout the city, judges and officials who owed them favors or feared their influence. Within a week, Joseph received a message warning him that if he continued to cause trouble, he too would find himself enslaved or simply disappeared. The message was clear, and Joseph, heartbroken and terrified, understood that he had lost the battle before it truly began. He continued to work in his shop, but neighbors said he became a hollow man, going through the motions of life while his spirit had been broken. Eliza was installed in the servants' quarters of the Beaumont townhouse, a cramped room in the attic that she shared with 2 other enslaved women. Her new reality was incomprehensible to someone who had lived free for 24 years. She was given a rough cotton dress to replace her own clothes, fed scraps from the family's table, and immediately put to work not as a midwife but as a general servant. Madame Beaumont, recovering from childbirth and enjoying the attention her new baby brought from society friends, seemed to take particular pleasure in ordering Eliza around, perhaps sensing that this woman had once been her equal in some fundamental way. The first months were the hardest. Eliza spent her days scrubbing floors, washing clothes, tending to the children, and performing countless other tasks that left her exhausted by nightfall. She was not allowed to leave the property. She was not allowed to receive mail or visitors. She existed now as property, and the Beaumont family made sure she understood her new place. Monsieur Beaumont, who had seemed merely stern before, revealed himself to be cruel when his authority was questioned. Eliza watched him beat other enslaved people in the household for minor infractions, his face impassive as he brought down the leather strap. She learned quickly to keep her head down, to say yes ma'am and yes sir, to move through the house like a ghost. The other enslaved people in the Beaumont household responded to Eliza's arrival with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. They recognized the signs of someone newly enslaved, the way she moved with the wrong kind of confidence, the way her hands sometimes paused in their work as if she had forgotten for a moment that she was not free to stop when she chose. An older woman named Patience, who served as the household cook and had been enslaved by the Beaumont family since childhood, took it upon herself to teach Eliza the unspoken rules that governed survival in the household. She explained which hallways to avoid at certain times of day, which of the Beaumont children was most likely to report perceived infractions, how to appear busy even during rare moments of rest so that Madame Beaumont would not find additional tasks to assign. Patience had a weathered face that showed every one of her estimated 50 years, though she did not know her exact age since birth records had never been kept for enslaved people on the Beaumont plantation where she had been born. She had witnessed generations of Beaumonts grow up, marry, have children of their own, and she had developed a protective hardness that allowed her to endure. She told Eliza during stolen moments in the kitchen when no one else was listening that the key to survival was to become invisible, to perform your duties so efficiently that the family forgot you were human at all. It was not advice that would bring happiness or dignity, but it was advice that might keep you alive and relatively intact. There were 5 other enslaved people living in the Beaumont townhouse. Besides Patience and Eliza, there was Marcus, a man of about 30 who served as both driver and general handyman, responsible for maintaining the carriage and horses, as well as making repairs around the property. There was Ruth, a young woman barely out of her teens who served as lady's maid to Madame Beaumont, helping her dress and styling her hair and attending to her various needs throughout the day. There was Isaiah, an older man who worked as butler and footman, serving meals and greeting guests and managing the household's public face. And there was Lily, a girl of perhaps 12 or 13 who performed various menial tasks and was being trained to eventually take over some of Ruth's duties as she grew older. Each of these people carried their own stories of loss and survival, their own methods of coping with their bondage. Marcus had been born free in Kentucky but had been kidnapped while traveling south to visit relatives, sold into slavery with forged papers much like Eliza's own. He never spoke of his former life except in the vaguest terms, as if discussing it directly might break something fragile inside him. Ruth had been born enslaved on the Beaumont plantation and had been brought to the city when Madame Beaumont decided she wanted a young maid she could train to her exact specifications. Ruth dreamed of escape to the north, spending her rare, free moments learning to read with help from Isaiah, who had been taught by a previous enslaved person in the household who had since died. Isaiah himself had been enslaved by the Beaumont family for more than 20 years. Having been purchased as a young man after his previous enslaver died and his estate was liquidated. He had a wife and children on the plantation upriver, people he was allowed to visit perhaps twice a year if the family was in a generous mood. Lily's story was the most heartbreaking in its simplicity. She had been born to an enslaved mother on the Beaumont plantation, and when that mother died from infection after a difficult childbirth, Lily had been brought to the city where she could be put to work despite her young age. She had no memories of her mother, no family connections, nothing but the work assigned to her and the hope that someday things might be different, though she had no real conception of what different might look like. Eliza formed tentative connections with these people during her first months of enslavement, drawn together by shared circumstance, even though true intimacy was difficult when any one of them might be sold away at any moment. They developed a kind of shorthand communication, exchanging information and support through glances and brief whispers, creating a network of mutual protection that existed beneath the notice of the Beaumont family. When Eliza was locked in the storage room after James was sold, it was Marcus who managed to slip her a cup of water during one of his maintenance rounds, risking punishment if he had been caught. When she emerged from that confinement changed and hollow, it was Patience who guided her back to her duties and gave her the space to grieve in whatever way she could while still performing the work required of her. None of them knew what Eliza was planning during those months when she collected her poisons and perfected her recipes for death. She told no one, shared her intentions with no one, allowed no hint of her plans to show on her face or in her actions. This was partly out of consideration for them, understanding that knowledge of her intentions would make them complicit and put them in danger if the plot was discovered. But it was also out of a kind of isolation that had grown around her heart like scar tissue, a barrier that prevented her from truly connecting with anyone after James was taken. She moved among them as one of them, but some essential part of her had separated, had floated away to a place where their concerns and hopes could not reach her. But the worst part, the aspect of her enslavement that cut deeper than any physical punishment, came when she discovered she was pregnant. The baby had been conceived in those final weeks of her freedom, a last gift from her time with Joseph. As her belly grew, Eliza felt a complicated mix of joy and terror. She cherished the life growing inside her, this connection to the man she loved and the free life she had lost. Yet she knew that her child would be born into slavery, would legally belong to the Beaumont family from the moment of first breath. The knowledge ate at her constantly, poisoning what should have been a time of anticipation and hope. Madame Beaumont noticed the pregnancy and seemed pleased in a calculating way. Another enslaved child meant more property, more future labor for the family. She insisted that Eliza continue her regular duties throughout the pregnancy, showing none of the care and consideration that Eliza had provided during Madame Beaumont's own childbirth. Eliza scrubbed floors until her back screamed in pain. She carried heavy loads of laundry up and down stairs. She was given barely enough food to sustain herself, let alone nourish a growing baby. When she asked for lighter duties or more food, Madame Beaumont would smile coldly and remind her that enslaved women had been giving birth while working in the fields for generations. So surely Eliza could manage a few household chores. The baby, a boy Eliza named James after her own father, was born on a cold February morning in 1838. She delivered him herself in her attic room with only another enslaved woman to help, biting down on a leather strap to muffle her cries because Madame Beaumont had forbidden her from disturbing the household with noise. When James emerged, small and perfect, Eliza felt a love so fierce it frightened her. She held him and whispered promises she knew she might not be able to keep, telling him about his father, about the freedom he should have had, about the life they would find together somehow. For 3 months, Eliza cared for James while also being forced to nurse baby Josephine Beaumont. Madame Beaumont's own milk had dried up, and she found it convenient to use Eliza as a wet nurse. This meant that Eliza's time and milk, the sustenance meant for her own child, was divided between James and Josephine. Madame Beaumont made it clear that Josephine was to be fed first and fed more, that the white baby's needs superseded those of the enslaved infant. Eliza would nurse Josephine until the baby was satisfied, and only then was she permitted to feed her own son, who often cried from hunger while waiting his turn. The arrangement took its toll on James. He was not getting enough milk, not growing as he should. His cries became weaker, and Eliza could see him losing weight, his small body becoming more fragile with each passing week. She begged Madame Beaumont to allow her to feed James more, to let her focus on her own child's health. She even offered to teach another enslaved woman in the household how to prepare suitable foods for Josephine now that the baby was old enough for other nourishment. But Madame Beaumont refused, seeming to enjoy the power she held over Eliza's maternal instincts. Sometimes Eliza would catch Madame Beaumont watching her with a knowing smile when Josephine fed contentedly at Eliza's breast while James waited, his small face scrunched with hunger. The breaking point came on a humid May afternoon when James was 5 months old. Eliza had just finished nursing Josephine and had finally been allowed to feed her own son. She held him in her arms, feeling his weak attempts to suckle, when Monsieur Beaumont entered the nursery with another man, a slave trader from Virginia named Charles Whitmore. They stood discussing business while Eliza sat frozen, James at her breast, suddenly understanding what was about to happen. Monsieur Beaumont gestured toward her, mentioning casually that he had an infant he was willing to sell. Healthy stock that would grow into a strong worker. The words were spoken as if James were a calf or a piglet, not a human child with his mother's eyes and his father's chin. Eliza tried to run, clutching James to her chest as she bolted for the door. But Monsieur Beaumont was faster, grabbing her arm with a grip that left bruises and wrenching the baby from her embrace. Eliza screamed, begged, offered anything she could think of, but her pleas were ignored. James was handed to the trader, who examined him with the detached interest of someone appraising livestock, commenting that the baby was a bit small but should fill out with proper feeding. Money changed hands, a sum that seemed impossibly small for a human life. $45 that Monsieur Beaumont pocketed with satisfaction. Eliza was held back by 2 other men as the trader left with James, her son's cries fading as he was carried down the stairs and out into the street. Something broke inside Eliza that day, some essential piece of her humanity that could not be put back together. She was thrown into a storage room for 2 days as punishment for her outburst. given no food or water, left alone with her grief and rage. When she was finally released and returned to her duties, the other enslaved people in the household noticed the change in her. The light had gone from her eyes. She moved through her tasks like an automaton, speaking only when spoken to, showing no emotion even when Madame Beaumont made cruel comments about James's sale, or about how much better Josephine was thriving now that Eliza could devote all her milk to the white baby. But behind Eliza's blank expression, something was germinating. She began to remember everything her mother had taught her, all those lessons about plants and their properties. She remembered which flowers brought healing and which brought death. She thought about the deadly nightshade that grew wild in certain parts of Louisiana, its purple-black berries containing enough toxins to kill a grown man. She recalled the castor bean plant, the oleander, the water hemlock. Her mother had taught her about these plants, not to use them but to recognize them, to warn pregnant women away from them, to ensure they were never accidentally ingested. But knowledge, like any tool, could be used for different purposes. Eliza began volunteering for kitchen duties, offering to help prepare meals even though it meant additional work on top of her regular tasks. Cook, an older enslaved woman named Patience who had served the Beaumont family for 30 years, was grateful for the assistance. Eliza proved to be skilled in the kitchen, and within a few weeks, Patience was allowing her to take on more responsibilities. Eliza learned the family's preferences, which dishes Monsieur Beaumont favored, what Madame Beaumont liked to eat for breakfast, which desserts the children would beg for. She made herself indispensable, and the family began to relax around her, no longer seeing her as the screaming, desperate mother from months before, but as a properly broken servant who had accepted her place. During this time, Eliza also began taking walks in the small garden behind the townhouse, ostensibly to hang laundry or tend to the herbs used for cooking. She would disappear for short periods, slipping out during the brief moments when no one was watching. She knew New Orleans well from her years of freedom, knew which gardens and wild places contained the plants she needed. She collected nightshade berries, pressing them into a small cloth bag she kept hidden in her dress. She gathered foxglove leaves, oleander flowers, and seeds from the chinaberry tree. Each plant contained its own specific poison, some working quickly while others took time to build up in the body. Eliza studied her collection with the same careful attention she had once given to healing herbs, learning to recognize the exact dosage needed for different effects. Months passed, and Eliza became a trusted member of the household staff, at least in the sense that the Beaumonts no longer watched her as closely as they once had. She cooked many of the family's meals now, and they praised her gumbo, her roasted meats, her delicate pastries. The children, who had once ignored her, now asked specifically for her to make their favorite dishes. Even Madame Beaumont, who had taken such pleasure in Eliza's suffering, seemed to forget sometimes that this competent cook had once been a free woman with a husband and a stolen child. During these months, Eliza also heard news from the outside world through other enslaved people who were hired out or sent on errands. She learned that Joseph was still in New Orleans, still working in his shop, still alone. The news filled her with a complicated emotion that was part love, part guilt, part something else she could not name. She wanted to send him a message, to let him know she was alive and that she thought of him constantly. But she knew any attempt at communication would be discovered and punished, and she could not risk it. Not now, not when she had finally decided what she needed to do. The decision to poison the Beaumont family had not come in a single moment, but had grown gradually like a vine wrapping around a tree. Eliza knew she could never escape in any conventional sense. She had no papers, no money, no allies powerful enough to challenge the Beaumont family's ownership claim. Even if she managed to run, she would be caught and returned, and the punishment would be severe. She had seen what happened to enslaved people who tried to escape. the scars they carried, the permanent damage done to their bodies and spirits. But more than that, Eliza did not just want freedom for herself anymore. She wanted justice for James, for the months of starvation she had witnessed, for the moment he was ripped from her arms. She wanted the Beaumont family to pay for what they had done, to feel a fraction of the pain they had caused. Eliza was not naive about what her actions would mean. She knew that killing a white family, especially one as prominent as the Beaumonts, would result in her own death. She would be caught, tortured for information about accomplices, and then executed in a manner designed to terrify other enslaved people into submission. But she found she did not care about her own survival anymore. The woman she had been, the skilled midwife who took pride in bringing new life into the world, had died when James was sold. What remained was someone harder, colder, someone who understood that sometimes the only way to end suffering was through fire. She chose a date in early November 1839, more than a year after James had been taken from her. The weather was cooling and the family had all been in residence at the townhouse for several weeks. A rare occurrence since they usually split their time between the city and their plantation. Eliza wanted all of them present for what she had planned. She wanted Monsieur Beaumont, who had forged the papers that enslaved her. She wanted Madame Beaumont, who had starved her child and smiled while doing it. She even wanted the children, which troubled some small remaining piece of her conscience. But she reminded herself that Henri, at 11 years old, had already learned to order enslaved people around with his father's cruelty. That Marguerite, at 7, had started treating the household staff with her mother's disdain. Only baby Josephine, now past 2 years old, was innocent. But Eliza had nursed Josephine with milk meant for James, had watched Josephine thrive while her own son wasted away. The rage she felt was not rational or measured. It was all-consuming. The day of the chosen dinner, Eliza rose before dawn and went to the kitchen. She had told Cook the previous evening that she would handle all the meal preparation, claiming she wanted to create something special to thank the family for their recent decision to allow the household staff an extra ration of cornmeal each week. Cook, pleased to have a day with lighter duties, agreed readily. Eliza worked alone, her hands steady as she prepared each dish. She made a rich gumbo filled with shrimp and andouille sausage, its dark roux hiding the ground nightshade berries she stirred in slowly, carefully measuring the amount to ensure it would be enough to poison, but not so much that the taste would be noticeably affected. She roasted a duck with a cherry glaze, and into the glaze she mixed a tincture she had prepared from foxglove leaves. The cardiac glycosides they contained, potent enough to cause heart problems in anyone who consumed enough. For the vegetables, she prepared a cream sauce seasoned with what appeared to be thyme and parsley, but which also contained finely chopped pieces of oleander leaf, their toxins capable of causing severe gastrointestinal distress and potentially cardiac arrest. She baked bread using flour she had contaminated with crushed chinaberry seeds, which contained compounds that would attack the nervous system. Every dish on the table that evening would contain something deadly, and together they would create a cocktail of poisons that no doctor would be able to counteract, especially not if the family was not treated immediately. As evening approached and the time for dinner neared, Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her. She dressed in her cleanest work dress, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and moved through the final preparations with the efficiency of someone performing a well-rehearsed task. She set the dining table with the family's finest china, polished the silver until it gleamed, arranged fresh flowers in a crystal vase at the center of the table. Everything had to be perfect for this last meal. The Beaumont family gathered in the dining room at 6 o'clock, as was their custom. Monsieur Beaumont sat at the head of the table, Madame Beaumont at the foot, with the children arranged along the sides. They chatted about trivial matters while Eliza and another servant brought out the dishes. Monsieur Beaumont commented on how delicious everything smelled, and Madame Beaumont asked if this was a special occasion. Eliza, standing by the door ready to attend to any needs, replied calmly that she had simply wanted to show her gratitude for the family's kindness. The irony of her words hung in the air, unnoticed by the family who had never considered their treatment of her to be anything but appropriate. Eliza watched as they began to eat, their forks and spoons moving from plates to mouths, with the unconscious grace of people who had never questioned their right to abundance. She watched Henri devour his gumbo, watched Marguerite sip the sauce from her vegetables with obvious pleasure, watched little Josephine smear the cherry glaze across her face as she ate pieces of duck. She watched Monsieur and Madame Beaumont compliment the meal between bites, discussing plans for the upcoming social season and debating whether to invest in more land upriver. They were completely unaware that with each swallow they were consuming their own deaths. The effects began approximately 30 minutes into the meal. Monsieur Beaumont was the first to show symptoms, his face flushing red as his heart began to race from the foxglove. He loosened his collar, complaining of the heat despite the cool November evening. Madame Beaumont soon followed, her hand going to her stomach as the oleander started to cause nausea and cramping. The children began to look ill as well, their faces taking on a pale, sweaty appearance. At first, the family assumed it was a passing discomfort. Perhaps someone had eaten too quickly or the food had been too rich. But as the minutes passed and the symptoms intensified, they began to realize something was seriously wrong. Within an hour, the Beaumont family was in crisis. Monsieur Beaumont's heart was beating erratically, his breathing labored as he clutched at his chest. Madame Beaumont was vomiting violently, her body trying desperately to expel the poisons but unable to rid itself of what had already been absorbed into her bloodstream. The children were crying in pain and confusion, especially little Josephine, who could not understand why her stomach hurt so badly or why everything around her had started to look strange and distorted. Servants ran for doctors, sent for help, tried to comfort the stricken family members, but no one suspected that the dinner itself had been poisoned. And by the time the first doctor arrived, it was too late to do much good. Through all of this chaos, Eliza remained calm. She moved through the house, assisting where she was told to assist, fetching water and towels, helping to clean up after Madame Beaumont's vomiting. She watched the family suffer with the same blank expression she had worn for months, showing neither satisfaction nor remorse. When Cook asked her frantically if she knew what could have caused such sudden illness in the entire family, Eliza simply shook her head and suggested it might have been bad shrimp in the gumbo, even though she knew the shrimp had been perfectly fresh. The Beaumont family died over the course of that long night and into the next morning. Monsieur Beaumont went first, his compromised heart finally giving out around midnight. Henri followed a few hours later, his small body unable to withstand the combination of toxins. Madame Beaumont and Marguerite died within minutes of each other just after dawn, their bodies shutting down from multiple organ failure. Only little Josephine clung to life, and Eliza, in a moment of weakness or perhaps mercy, prepared an antidote tea using herbs that might counteract some of the poisons in the child's system. She fed it to Josephine in small sips while no one was watching. Not enough to fully save her, but perhaps enough to ease her passing. Josephine died peacefully in her sleep later that morning, unlike the rest of her family whose final hours had been marked by agony. The authorities were called, and an investigation was launched into the deaths. The initial assumption was that the family had contracted some disease, perhaps cholera or typhoid, though the doctors were puzzled by the specific symptoms and the fact that none of the household staff had fallen ill. They questioned everyone who had been in the house, including Eliza, who repeated her theory about bad shrimp calmly and convincingly. She showed no signs of guilt or nervousness, answering every question with the deference expected of an enslaved woman speaking to white authorities. It was not until 3 days after the deaths that suspicion began to turn toward Eliza. One of the other servants, a woman who had been jealous of Eliza's position in the kitchen, mentioned to the investigators that Eliza had been the one to prepare the entire fatal meal alone, which was unusual. Another servant recalled seeing Eliza return from walks in the garden with small cloth bags that she kept hidden. Slowly, the investigators began to piece together a different narrative, one in which the deaths were not accidental but intentional murder. Eliza was arrested and taken to the city jail, a grim building where enslaved people accused of crimes against white people were held. The jail itself was a testament to the brutality of the system, with cells that were barely large enough to lie down in, inadequate food and water, and no protection from the heat that made the interior feel like an oven during the day. Eliza was placed in a cell by herself, considered too dangerous to be housed with other prisoners, and she spent her days sitting on the stone floor watching shadows move across the wall as the sun traced its path across the sky. She was questioned repeatedly, sometimes gently and sometimes with threats of torture. The investigators wanted to know if she had accomplices, if other enslaved people in the city were planning similar attacks, if this was part of some larger conspiracy that threatened the entire structure of slavery in Louisiana. The authorities were genuinely terrified by what Eliza had done, not just because of the deaths themselves, but because of what they represented. If enslaved people could not be trusted to prepare food for their enslavers, if they might use their positions of seeming submission to exact such complete revenge, then the entire system of control became suspect. Every white family in New Orleans who employed enslaved servants suddenly had to consider whether the people cooking their meals, tending their children, and moving through their homes might harbor similar rage and similar plans. Eliza told them nothing except that she had acted alone, that no one else had been involved or even aware of her plans. She described in detail how she had collected the plants, how she had prepared the poisons, how she had added them to each dish. Her confession was delivered in the same calm tone she had used when discussing the family's dinner preferences, as if she were describing something mundane rather than a mass murder. The investigators found her demeanor unsettling, expecting her to show either remorse or defiant anger, but finding instead only a kind of tranquil acceptance that made her seem almost otherworldly. During her time in jail, Eliza was visited by various people whose motivations ranged from genuine concern to morbid curiosity. A journalist from one of the city newspapers came to interview her, hoping to write an account of the poisoning that would satisfy the public's hunger for details about the sensational case. Eliza answered his questions politely but without elaboration, confirming facts but offering no insight into her emotional state or her reasoning. The journalist left frustrated, having hoped for tears or theatrical declarations of vengeance, and instead having received only calm, factual responses that made for far less interesting copy than he had anticipated. Several enslaved people managed to visit Eliza during her final days, arranging these meetings through bribes paid to guards or through connections with white people who could authorize such visits. These conversations, conducted in whispers and always aware that guards might be listening, revealed different facets of how Eliza's action was being interpreted within the enslaved community. Some visitors came to thank her, to tell her that she had struck a blow for all of them, that her willingness to sacrifice herself to punish her enslavers had given others a sense that resistance was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Others came to argue with her, to tell her that her violence had made things worse for all enslaved people, that the increased scrutiny and harsher controls being implemented in response to her crime would cause suffering for countless innocent people. One visitor, a woman named Celeste who had known Eliza during her years of freedom and who remembered her as a skilled and compassionate midwife, spent an entire visit crying, mourning not just for what Eliza had done, but for the person she had been before the Beaumont family destroyed her. Celeste asked Eliza how she could have killed children, how she could have taken lives when her calling had been to save them, how she could have abandoned everything she had once believed in about the sanctity of life. Eliza listened to these questions without visible emotion, and finally responded that the woman Celeste had known was dead, had died the day James was sold, and that what remained was someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop evil was to become monstrous yourself. Another visitor was an older man named Solomon who had been enslaved for more than 40 years, and who had survived through a combination of luck, intelligence, and the ability to make himself useful enough that his enslavers considered him too valuable to risk losing through punishment or sale. Solomon did not come to judge Eliza or to praise her. Instead, he came to bear witness, to look into the eyes of someone who had done what many enslaved people fantasized about but few ever attempted. He told Eliza that he understood why she had done what she did, that he had known others over the years who had reached similar breaking points and had responded with violence, though few had managed to exact such complete revenge. He told her that her story would be remembered, that it would be told and retold, and that different people would draw different lessons from it. He asked her what she wanted people to remember about her, and Eliza thought for a long moment before responding that she wanted people to remember that she had loved her son, that everything else that happened had flowed from that love and from its destruction. Perhaps the most unexpected visitor was a white woman named Margaret Winters, who came to the jail accompanied by her husband and by a guard who watched their conversation carefully. Margaret was a mother of 3 who had employed Eliza as a midwife several years earlier before Eliza's enslavement, and who had always treated her with respect and kindness. Margaret came to tell Eliza that she was horrified by what had happened, both by Eliza's enslavement and by her subsequent actions. She wanted to understand how the gentle woman who had delivered her children could have become someone capable of mass murder. Eliza looked at this white woman who genuinely seemed to want answers, and she tried to explain in terms that someone who had never experienced enslavement might understand. She told Margaret about the sensation of being transformed overnight from a person into property, about the disorientation of having your entire identity erased by forged documents and corrupt officials. She described the experience of nursing Josephine Beaumont while her own son starved, of having to choose which baby received sustenance, when there should have been enough for both. She explained the moment when James was sold, the physical sensation of having him ripped from her arms, the sound of his cries fading as he was carried away to a fate she would never know. She spoke about the months that followed when she moved through her days like a ghost, when the only thing that gave her any sense of purpose was planning the Beaumont family's deaths. And she told Margaret that she understood these explanations would not be satisfying, that there was no way to truly convey the experience of enslavement to someone who had never lived it, but that she hoped Margaret might at least understand that people who are treated as less than human will eventually internalize that treatment in ways that destroy their ability to function according to the moral codes of the society that enslaved them. Margaret left the jail weeping, and her husband had to support her as they walked back to their carriage. She wrote in her diary that night, in an entry that would be discovered decades later by historians researching the period, that she had looked into Eliza Monroe's eyes and had seen something that terrified her. Not because Eliza seemed evil or insane, but because she seemed perfectly sane and perfectly at peace with what she had done. Margaret wrote that this encounter had forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about the society she lived in and benefited from. Questions about what it meant that the system of slavery could transform a healer into a killer and then execute her for refusing to accept her bondage gracefully. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than a day. Enslaved people were not permitted to testify in their own defense in Louisiana courts, and the evidence against Eliza was overwhelming given her detailed confession. The verdict was predetermined, and she was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out publicly as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of harming white people. The judge who pronounced sentence spoke about the heinousness of her crime, about the betrayal of the family's trust, about the need to maintain order and control over the enslaved population. Eliza listened without reaction, her face a mask that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. In the days leading up to her execution, Eliza was visited by a priest who tried to get her to repent for her sins. He spoke about salvation and forgiveness, about the importance of asking God's mercy before she faced judgment in the afterlife. Eliza listened politely but said nothing about repentance. When pressed, she told the priest that she had no regrets about the Beaumont family's deaths, that they had earned their fate through their cruelty, that if God wanted to judge her for taking justice into her own hands, then she would accept that judgment. The priest left troubled, writing later in his diary that he had never met a condemned person so utterly at peace with their actions. Eliza was also visited by several other enslaved people from various households, people who had heard her story and wanted to see her before the end. These visits had to be arranged secretly and often involved bribing guards, but the visitors came anyway, driven by a complicated mix of horror and admiration. Some asked her if it had been worth it, if the satisfaction of revenge had been enough to justify her own impending death. Eliza told them that she had stopped caring about her own life the day James was sold, that the past year and a half had been borrowed time she had used to accomplish the one thing that mattered. Others asked if she was afraid of dying, and Eliza admitted that she was not afraid of death itself, but hoped it would be quick. The execution was scheduled for a Monday morning in late November, 2 weeks after the Beaumont family had died. The date was chosen deliberately on a Monday when the city's business district was most active, when the largest number of people, both white and enslaved, would be present to witness the consequences of striking against the established order. A crowd began gathering in the public square hours before the scheduled execution, people claiming positions with good views of the gallows that had been erected specifically for this event. The crowd was a strange mixture of people with very different reasons for being there. Some white citizens came out of a sense that justice needed to be witnessed, that the execution of someone who had committed such a heinous crime was a civic duty to observe. Others came out of simple curiosity, drawn by the sensational nature of the case and by the opportunity to see something dramatic. The enslaved people in the crowd were there by compulsion rather than choice, forced to attend by their enslavers who wanted them to see what happened to those who raised their hands against white people. The message being sent was clear and brutal. No matter your grievances, no matter your suffering, resistance would be met with death, and that death would be public and would be witnessed by everyone you knew. Enslaved people stood in designated sections of the square, many of them in work groups with their enslavers watching to ensure they paid attention. Some stared at the ground, unwilling or unable to watch. Others kept their eyes fixed on the gallows, expressions unreadable, processing the spectacle in their own private ways. Eliza was brought out in chains shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning, emerging from the jail accompanied by 4 guards who seemed alert for any sign that someone might attempt to rescue her, or that violence might erupt from the crowd. She wore the same simple dress she had been arrested in, now stained and worn from 2 weeks in jail, her hair still tied back in that same strip of cloth. She walked steadily toward the gallows, her head held high, her expression unchanged from the calm mask she had worn since the Beaumont family's deaths. She climbed the steps without assistance, her movements deliberate and unhurried, refusing the hood offered to cover her face, wanting to see everything in these final moments. The official in charge of the execution, a magistrate named Robert Chalmers, who had overseen dozens of such events during his career, read out the charges and the sentence in a loud voice that carried across the square. He spoke of the gravity of her crime, of the betrayal of trust, of the necessity of maintaining order and control. He described the deaths of the Beaumont family in detail, perhaps hoping to turn the crowd against Eliza, or perhaps simply following protocol that required such recitations. When he finished, he asked Eliza if she had any final words, a formality rarely extended to enslaved people but granted in this case because the authorities wanted her to express remorse that could be publicized, that could serve as evidence that even the most hardened criminal could be brought to repentance through the threat of death. Instead of the expected plea for forgiveness or expression of regret, Eliza looked out at the crowd and began to sing. Her voice was clear and strong in the morning air, cutting through the murmuring of the assembled people with a purity that seemed impossible given her circumstances. She sang a hymn that had been her mother's favorite, a song about crossing the river into freedom, about leaving sorrow behind and finding peace in the arms of God. The hymn was well known among enslaved people throughout the South, often sung at funerals and in secret religious gatherings, and many in the crowd recognized it immediately. The lyrics spoke of struggle and suffering and ultimate liberation, themes that resonated powerfully in a context where most of the enslaved people present could see no realistic path to freedom in their lifetimes. The white authorities in the square were visibly uncomfortable with Eliza's singing, conferring in urgent whispers about whether to stop her or to allow her to continue. They were caught between their desire to maintain complete control over the proceedings and their awareness that forcibly silencing a condemned woman as she sang a hymn might create sympathies they did not want to encourage. In the end, they allowed her to continue, perhaps calculating that the execution itself would override any emotional impact of her final song. But they had miscalculated. As Eliza sang, other voices began to join hers. Quietly at first, barely audible, enslaved people scattered throughout the crowd began to sing along. The sound grew gradually, not loud enough to be called defiant, but present enough to be noticed. A chorus of voices that transformed Eliza's solo into something collective, something that suggested solidarity and shared experience. Some of the white people in the crowd looked around nervously, suddenly aware that they were surrounded by enslaved people who might harbor similar grievances, similar rage, similar willingness to strike back if pushed far enough. This was exactly the fear that the execution was meant to quell, but somehow the singing had transformed the event into something else, had created a moment where the usual power dynamics felt less stable than they were supposed to. The guards tightened their grips on their weapons, ready to intervene if the singing escalated into something more dangerous. But the enslaved people in the crowd were too wise to cross that line. They sang quietly, almost peacefully, making their statement without providing justification for violent response. Eliza sang until the very end, her voice never wavering even as the noose was placed around her neck, even as the platform dropped and her body fell. The hymn's final notes hung in the air even after she was gone, carried on the wind across the square and into the streets beyond. The witnesses would later disagree about the exact moment of her death, some claiming she died instantly while others insisted she struggled for several minutes, but they all agreed on the expression on her face. She looked peaceful, they said, almost relieved, as if death was not a punishment but a release she had been seeking all along. The immediate aftermath of the execution was chaotic in ways the authorities had not anticipated. Rather than dispersing quietly as expected, the crowd lingered in the square, people standing in small groups discussing what they had just witnessed. Some white citizens expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, but others seemed troubled by what they had seen. particularly by the singing and by the strange dignity Eliza had maintained even in her final moments. The enslaved people who had been forced to attend were herded back to their workplaces by nervous enslavers who were increasingly aware of how much their safety and comfort depended on the acquiescence of people who had every reason to hate them. In the days following the execution, New Orleans became a city on edge. White families began scrutinizing their enslaved servants with new suspicion, looking for signs of potential danger in every action and expression. Enslaved cooks in particular found themselves under intense surveillance, with their enslavers sometimes insisting on watching meal preparation or demanding that the cook eat a portion of every dish before serving it to the family. These precautions were based on paranoia more than any real increase in poisoning attempts, but they created an atmosphere of mistrust and tension that affected everyone. Some enslaved people lost positions they had held for years because their enslavers could no longer bear the anxiety of having them in the house. Others faced new restrictions and harsher punishments for minor infractions, as if their enslavers believed that increased brutality would somehow prevent resistance rather than provoke it. The execution was scheduled for a Monday morning in late November, 2 weeks after the Beaumont family had died. A crowd gathered in the public square where the gallows had been erected, a mix of white citizens who wanted to see justice done and enslaved people who had been forced to attend as a warning. Eliza was brought out in chains, her simple dress clean but worn, her hair still tied back in that same strip of cloth. She walked steadily toward the gallows, her head held high, her expression unchanged. She climbed the steps without assistance, refusing the hood offered to cover her face, wanting to see everything in these final moments. Before the noose was placed around her neck, Eliza was given a chance to speak final words, a formality rarely extended to enslaved people, but granted in this case perhaps because the authorities wanted her to express remorse that could be publicized. Instead, Eliza looked out at the crowd and began to sing, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. She sang a hymn that had been her mother's favorite, a song about crossing the river into freedom, about leaving sorrow behind and finding peace in the arms of God. The hymn was well known among enslaved people throughout the South, often sung at funerals and in secret religious gatherings, and many in the crowd recognized it. Some of the enslaved people forced to watch began to sing along quietly, their voices joining hers in a moment of defiance that made the white authorities uncomfortable, but which they did not immediately stop. Eliza sang until the very end, her voice never wavering even as the noose was placed around her neck, even as the platform dropped and her body fell. The witnesses would later say that her expression remained peaceful throughout, that she seemed almost relieved as death came. The hymn's final notes hung in the air even after she was gone, carried on the wind across the square and into the streets beyond. In the aftermath of Eliza's execution, her story spread throughout the South in whispers and coded references. She became both warning and legend, an example used by white slaveholders to justify harsher controls, and by enslaved people as proof that even in the depths of oppression, resistance was possible. Some versions of the story emphasized her cruelty, painting her as a monster who had killed innocent children. Others focused on her suffering, on the child stolen from her arms, on the impossible choice between accepting endless brutality and striking back even at the cost of her own life. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in the complicated middle, in the place where desperation and rage and grief converge into action that cannot be easily judged. Different communities interpreted Eliza's actions through the lens of their own experiences and needs. In slaveholding households, her story became a cautionary tale used to justify increased surveillance and control of enslaved workers, particularly those who worked in kitchens or had access to the family's food. Madams throughout Louisiana began insisting on personally selecting and inspecting ingredients, on watching meal preparation, on keeping medicinal herbs and cooking herbs strictly separated and accounted for. The trust that had previously existed, or at least the illusion of trust, had been shattered by Eliza's methodical revenge. Within enslaved communities, however, the story took on different meanings depending on who was telling it and who was listening. Some elders used it as a warning to younger people about the consequences of direct resistance, pointing out that Eliza's action had resulted not in freedom but in death, and that her suffering had not been alleviated but merely ended. They argued that survival required patience, that open rebellion was suicide, that the path to freedom lay in endurance and in waiting for circumstances to change. Others, particularly those who had experienced losses similar to Eliza's, those who had watched their children sold away or their families torn apart, saw her story differently. To them, Eliza represented a refusal to accept the unacceptable, a willingness to assert human dignity even when the cost was ultimate. They did not necessarily advocate for others to follow her example, but they understood why she had done what she did, and they honored her memory in quiet ways that the white community never knew about. Joseph learned of Eliza's death 3 days after the execution, when a friend finally worked up the courage to tell him what had happened. The friend had attended the execution as part of a group of enslaved workers forced to witness it, and he described to Joseph how Eliza had walked to the gallows with her head high, how she had sung that hymn about crossing the river to freedom, how her voice had been strong and clear until the very end. Joseph listened to this account sitting in his workshop surrounded by half-finished furniture, his hands going still on the piece of wood he had been sanding. When his friend finished talking, Joseph said nothing for a long time, just sat there staring at the wood grain as if he might find answers in its patterns. The news broke something in Joseph that had already been badly damaged by Eliza's enslavement and James's sale, something fundamental that could not be repaired. He had spent the 18 months since Eliza's kidnapping trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, going through the motions of his work, fulfilling his commissions, interacting with customers and suppliers as if the core of his existence had not been ripped away. But he had been hollow inside, going through each day with mechanical efficiency while feeling nothing, hoping for nothing, existing in a kind of limbo where the past was too painful to think about and the future held nothing worth anticipating. The news of Eliza's execution ended even that fragile equilibrium. Within a week of learning about Eliza's death, Joseph closed his carpentry shop. He sold his tools to another craftsman, sold the furniture in his showroom at prices far below their value, as if eager to divest himself of everything that connected him to the life he had built in New Orleans. He paid the remaining months on his apartment lease and gave notice to his landlord. When friends and acquaintances asked what he planned to do, where he intended to go, he gave vague answers about heading west, about starting over somewhere new, about needing to leave a city that held too many painful memories. Some people said Joseph went north toward the Free States, trying to put distance between himself and the system that had destroyed his family. Others claimed he went west into Texas, which was still Mexican territory at the time and offered possibilities for someone willing to start over in a harsh and unsettled land. A few people insisted they saw him months later working on a riverboat headed up the Mississippi, though whether this was true or just a case of mistaken identity was never confirmed. What is certain is that Joseph Crane disappeared from New Orleans and from the historical record, becoming one of countless people whose stories were not deemed important enough to preserve in official documents or newspapers. His disappearance left questions that would never be answered about what became of him, whether he found any peace or happiness in whatever life he built after leaving, whether he ever stopped grieving for the wife and son he had lost. The Beaumont plantation upriver was sold to satisfy debts within 3 months of the family's deaths. The property had been mortgaged heavily, with Monsieur Beaumont having borrowed against it to fund his lifestyle in the city and his various business ventures. Without him to manage operations and with no direct heirs to inherit, the creditors moved quickly to liquidate the estate. The enslaved people there, more than 200 men, women, and children who had worked the sugarcane fields and maintained the plantation infrastructure, were scattered to new owners throughout Louisiana and beyond. Families that had been together for generations were separated, sold off in lots that maximized profit for the creditors with no consideration for the human cost. The plantation itself was purchased by a speculator from Mississippi who had no connection to the Beaumont family and who brought in his own overseer and management system. The townhouse in New Orleans stood empty for several years, a physical reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. Potential buyers were reluctant to purchase a property where an entire family had been poisoned, superstition mixing with genuine discomfort about the building's history. The few people who did express interest invariably backed out after learning the full details of what had happened. Eventually, the property was purchased at a significantly reduced price by a shipping merchant from Mobile who had no previous connection to New Orleans and who either did not know or did not care about the building's past. He renovated it extensively, tearing out the dining room where the Beaumont family had eaten their final meal, rebuilding the kitchen where Eliza had prepared her poisons, essentially creating a new structure within the bones of the old one. But servants who worked in neighboring houses continued to tell stories about the property, about strange sounds heard at night, about a woman in a simple dress who was sometimes seen standing in the garden where herbs and more dangerous plants grew wild. These ghost stories, like Eliza's own story, became part of the oral history passed down through generations of New Orleans residents. Whether anyone actually saw anything supernatural or whether these stories were simply ways of processing the horror of what had happened there is impossible to know. What is clear is that the building carried a reputation that persisted for decades, with each new owner learning eventually about its history and either making peace with it or selling the property and moving on. The other enslaved people who had lived in the Beaumont household at the time of the poisoning faced various fates in the aftermath. Patience, the cook who had trained Eliza in the kitchen, was questioned extensively by authorities trying to determine if she had known about or assisted with the poisoning plot. She maintained her innocence throughout, explaining truthfully that Eliza had prepared that final meal entirely alone, and that she had noticed nothing suspicious about Eliza's behavior in the preceding weeks. Eventually, the authorities concluded that Patience had not been involved, but the suspicion followed her nonetheless. She was sold to a family in Baton Rouge who needed a cook but who watched her constantly, never quite trusting her despite her years of faithful service to the Beaumonts. Marcus, the driver and handyman, was sold to a plantation owner who needed someone with his skills. Ruth, the young lady's maid, was purchased by a wealthy widow who wanted help managing her household. Isaiah, the butler, was bought by a hotel owner who recognized his polish and his ability to present a refined image. Lily, the young girl, was sold to a family with small children who needed help with childcare. Each of them carried the mark of having been associated with the Beaumont poisoning case, a stain that followed them to their new situations and that affected how they were treated by their new enslavers and by other enslaved people who knew their history. The impact of Eliza's action extended beyond individuals to affect the broader social and political landscape of antebellum Louisiana. In the Louisiana legislature, representatives from plantation districts introduced new laws aimed at controlling enslaved populations more strictly. These included requirements for more frequent inspections of slave quarters, prohibitions on enslaved people learning to read or gather medicinal plants, and increased penalties for any enslaved person found in possession of substances that could be used as poisons. The laws also created new obligations for slaveholders, requiring them to maintain detailed records of any illnesses or deaths among enslaved people and to report suspicious circumstances to authorities. Churches and religious organizations also responded to the Beaumont poisoning case, though in contradictory ways that reflected the fundamental hypocrisy of trying to maintain Christian principles while supporting slavery. Some ministers preached sermons about the importance of treating enslaved people humanely, arguing that Eliza's action demonstrated what happened when Christian charity was abandoned in favor of purely economic considerations. These sermons walked a careful line, condemning Eliza's violence while also suggesting that slaveholders bore some responsibility for creating the conditions that led to it. Other ministers took a harder line, preaching about the inherent sinfulness of black people, about the necessity of strict control and harsh punishment, about the danger of showing any weakness or mercy that might encourage further resistance. Medical professionals in New Orleans and throughout the South also took notice of the Beaumont case, particularly physicians who had been called to treat the family during their final hours. The case became a topic of discussion in medical journals and at professional gatherings, with doctors debating the specific poisons used and the symptoms they had produced. Some physicians published articles about how to recognize poisoning versus natural illness, creating diagnostic criteria that they hoped would allow for earlier intervention in future cases. Others focused on the prevention side, offering advice to slaveholders about how to secure medicines and keep dangerous plants away from enslaved people who might use them for harm. The newspaper coverage of the Beaumont poisoning and Eliza's execution reflected the racial politics and anxieties of the time. White newspapers portrayed Eliza as a monster, emphasizing the cold calculation involved in her crime and the innocence of her victims, particularly the children. These articles often included warnings about the dangers of trusting enslaved servants too completely, about the need for constant vigilance, about the potential for violence that supposedly lurked within every enslaved person, no matter how docile they might appear. The coverage rarely, if ever, mentioned Eliza's own victimization, the illegal enslavement that had destroyed her life, or the sale of her infant son. These details were considered irrelevant to the crime she had committed, or perhaps they were deliberately omitted because acknowledging them might complicate the simple narrative of black criminality that the newspapers wanted to present. Underground newspapers and abolitionist publications in the North told a different version of Eliza's story, one that emphasized her suffering and framed her action as a desperate response to unbearable cruelty. These publications used her case as evidence for their arguments against slavery, pointing out that a system which could drive a healer to become a killer was fundamentally corrupt and had to be abolished. They highlighted the hypocrisy of a legal system that recognized Eliza as property but then tried and executed her as a person when she committed a crime, noting that she was legally human enough to be held accountable for murder but not human enough to have rights that needed to be respected. These publications often included dramatic illustrations of Eliza's story, images of her singing hymns as she was hanged, images of her baby being torn from her arms, images designed to evoke sympathy from Northern readers and strengthen their resolve to oppose slavery's expansion. The debate over Eliza's case contributed to the growing sectional tension between North and South that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Northerners pointed to cases like hers as evidence that slavery was not the benign institution that Southern apologists claimed it to be. Southerners responded by arguing that Northern agitation and interference was encouraging enslaved people to rebel, that stories like Eliza's were being sensationalized and used to unfairly attack Southern society. These arguments became more heated as the years passed, with each side using Eliza's story to support their pre-existing positions rather than genuinely grappling with its moral complexity. In the decades that followed, Eliza Monroe's name surfaced occasionally in different contexts. Abolitionists in the North used her story as evidence of slavery's fundamental cruelty, arguing that the system itself had created the desperation that led to such violence. Pro-slavery advocates used her as an example of why enslaved people could not be trusted and needed to be controlled more strictly. Neither side seemed particularly interested in Eliza as a complete human being, a woman who had been a skilled healer before she became a killer, who had loved her husband and son, who had made a choice born from impossible circumstances. There were also quieter ways her story persisted. Midwives working among enslaved populations sometimes invoked her name when dealing with particularly cruel slaveholders, a subtle reminder that there were limits to what people would endure. Songs about her circulated in coded lyrics that sounded like traditional spirituals, but contained references that those who knew could recognize. In some communities, November, the month of her revenge and her execution, became a time to remember all those who had resisted oppression in whatever ways they could manage. The historical record preserves very little about who Eliza Monroe actually was beyond the bare facts of her crime and punishment. There are no photographs of her, no letters written in her hand, no detailed accounts from people who knew her well. What remains are legal documents about the Beaumont family's deaths, newspaper articles about her trial and execution, and the oral traditions that kept her story alive in various forms. From these fragments, we can reconstruct only an outline of her life, the details filled in by imagination and educated guesses about what life was like for a free black woman who was illegally enslaved in the 1830s South. What we do know is that Eliza's story in its various versions had an impact that extended far beyond her individual act of violence. It contributed to the growing tension between North and South over the slavery question, providing abolitionists with a visceral example of slavery's brutality while simultaneously terrifying slaveholders who began to see potential poisoners in every enslaved person who prepared their food. Some historians have argued that Eliza's action, along with other acts of resistance by enslaved people throughout the South, helped plant seeds that would eventually grow into more organized resistance and ultimately contribute to the conditions that led to the Civil War. But beyond these broader historical implications, Eliza's story remains a deeply personal tragedy about a woman who was pushed beyond her breaking point. She had been a healer, someone whose calling was to bring life into the world and to ease suffering. The transformation into someone who could methodically plan and execute the deaths of an entire family, including children, represents a profound psychological journey from light into darkness. Some might judge her harshly for that transformation, for choosing revenge over attempting to preserve her own humanity. Others might argue that she was already destroyed by what had been done to her, that the person who poisoned the Beaumonts was not really the same person who had been Eliza Monroe, free midwife of New Orleans. There is also the question of what alternatives, if any, existed for Eliza. She could have accepted her enslavement and tried to survive, hoping for eventual freedom through some change in circumstances or law. She could have attempted escape, though the likelihood of success was small and the consequences of failure were severe. She could have tried to find ways to resist that did not involve killing, small acts of sabotage or slowness that might have given her some sense of agency without resulting in deaths. But each of these alternatives required a level of hope or faith in the future that Eliza no longer possessed after James was sold. For her, the world had become a place so fundamentally unjust that the only meaningful action was to ensure that the people directly responsible for her suffering would not continue to live their comfortable lives untouched by consequences. The story of Eliza Monroe raises uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the limits of human endurance. It asks us to consider what we would do if placed in similar circumstances, though hopefully few of us can truly imagine the depths of desperation that characterized enslaved life in the antebellum South. It challenges us to think about the ways that systemic injustice creates conditions where violence becomes one of the few forms of agency available to the oppressed. And it reminds us that history is filled not just with grand political movements and famous leaders, but also with individual people making terrible choices in impossible situations, choices that echo forward through time in ways both expected and surprising. In the years since Eliza's death, countless other stories of resistance by enslaved people have been documented, from rebellions like the one led by Nat Turner to the thousands of individual acts of sabotage, escape, and defiance that characterized daily life under slavery. Eliza's story is unique in its specifics in the particular nature of her revenge and the methodical way she carried it out, but it is also representative of a larger truth about human nature under oppression. People will only accept being treated as less than human for so long before something breaks, before the instinct for survival gives way to the need for justice or revenge or simply to make the pain stop. The hymn that Eliza sang as she was hanged, that song about crossing the river into freedom, became associated with her story in the oral tradition. Enslaved people throughout the South knew it by different names, sometimes calling it Eliza's song or the nurse's hymn. The lyrics spoke of leaving behind earthly troubles and finding peace in the afterlife, themes that resonated deeply with people whose current existence offered so little hope for happiness or justice. Some versions of the song added verses that seemed to reference Eliza specifically, though the coded language made these references deniable if questioned by white listeners. The song persisted through Reconstruction and into the Jim Crow era, still occasionally sung at funerals or in churches, though the connection to Eliza's story gradually faded from common knowledge. In New Orleans itself, the memory of Eliza Monroe remained stronger and more specific. The city's complicated racial history, with its free people of color, its Creole culture, and its long tradition of resistance to various forms of oppression, meant that stories like Eliza's were preserved and passed down with more detail than in other parts of the South. Older residents in the mid-20th century could still point out where the Beaumont townhouse had stood, though the original building had long since been demolished and replaced. They could tell you about the garden behind the house where Eliza had supposedly gathered her poisons, about the public square where she had been executed, about the particular tone of defiance in her voice as she sang her final hymn. Modern historians studying the antebellum period have struggled with how to contextualize stories like Eliza's within the broader narrative of slavery and resistance. On one hand, her action can be seen as an example of the ultimate form of resistance, choosing death and taking her oppressors with her rather than accepting continued enslavement. On the other hand, the murder of children complicates any simple narrative of heroic resistance, forcing us to grapple with the moral ambiguities that arise when oppressed people commit violence against those who may be innocent, even if they benefit from unjust systems. These tensions reflect larger debates within historical scholarship about how to understand and represent the full complexity of enslaved people's lives and choices. What remains clear is that Eliza Monroe's story, whether we view her as a tragic figure, a murderous villain, or something in between, represents an important piece of American history. It reveals the human cost of slavery not just in physical terms, but in psychological and moral terms as well, showing how the institution corrupted and destroyed people on both sides of the relationship. The Beaumont family's casual cruelty, their assumption that they had the right to own other human beings and dispose of them as property, led directly to their own deaths. Eliza's transformation from healer to killer shows how oppression can warp and destroy the very humanity it claims to be managing and controlling. In the end, perhaps the most important aspect of Eliza's story is that it refuses easy answers or simple moral conclusions. It exists in the messy reality of human experience under inhuman conditions, showing us that people facing impossible choices will sometimes make choices that horrify us even as we understand, at least intellectually, how they arrived at those decisions. The story challenges us to think deeply about justice and revenge, about the line between self-defense and murder, about what it means to be pushed beyond the boundaries of normal moral reasoning by circumstances that themselves exist far outside any reasonable moral framework. Eliza Monroe walked to her death singing a hymn about freedom, and in that moment she claimed a kind of agency that the slave system tried to deny. Whether her action was justified, whether it accomplished anything beyond ending 6 lives, including her own, whether it should be celebrated or condemned or simply mourned, are questions that each person must answer for themselves. What cannot be disputed is that her story, preserved in fragments and embellished through oral tradition, serves as a powerful reminder of slavery's brutality and the lengths to which human beings will go when pushed beyond their capacity to endure. The legacy of Eliza Monroe lives on not in monuments or official histories, but in the whispered stories passed down through generations, in the coded references in old songs, in the continued debates among historians and ethicists about resistance and moral responsibility under oppression. She remains a figure who defies easy categorization, a woman who was both victim and perpetrator, who lost everything and then chose to take everything she could from those who had destroyed her life. Her story, uncomfortable and tragic and complicated as it is, deserves to be remembered and grappled with as we continue to reckon with the historical legacy of slavery and its ongoing impacts on American society. Eliza of New Orleans, the enslaved nurse who poisoned an entire household to end her suffering, stands as a testament to the darkest capabilities of the human spirit when subjected to unbearable cruelty. Her actions remind us that systems of oppression do not just exploit and abuse, they transform and corrupt, turning healers into killers and reducing human relationships to calculations of power and revenge. In remembering her story, we honor not just her individual tragedy, but all those who suffered under slavery's brutal regime. And we commit ourselves to ensuring that such conditions never arise again, that no person should ever be pushed to the point where death seems like the only form of agency available, where violence becomes the only language through which justice can be spoken. The morning of her execution, witnesses reported that Eliza walked to the gallows with her head held high, that she showed no fear and asked for no mercy. She sang her hymn in a clear voice that carried across the square and into the hearts of everyone who heard it, enslaved and free alike. And when the platform dropped and her life ended, some said they heard the wind carry her song further out across the city and the river beyond. A final note of defiance that could never be fully silenced. Whether this detail is true or embellishment added by later storytellers hardly matters. What matters is that Eliza Monroe, in her final moments, claimed her own narrative, refused to be simply a victim or a criminal, and instead became something more complicated and human. A woman who made a terrible choice in terrible circumstances and faced the consequences without flinching. That courage, however dark its origins, remains part of her legacy. A reminder that even in the depths of oppression, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself, for better and for worse. In the decades following Eliza's execution, her story continued to evolve and spread, taking on different forms as it was adapted to serve different purposes and audiences. During the Civil War, when enslaved people throughout the South learned about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and began fleeing to Union lines, some of them carried stories of Eliza Monroe with them. Union officers interviewing these refugees about conditions under slavery occasionally heard references to the enslaved nurse in New Orleans who had poisoned her enslavers, though the details were often garbled or confused with other stories of resistance. These accounts were sometimes included in reports sent back to Washington, contributing to Northern understanding of slavery's brutality and of the lengths to which enslaved people would go to escape or resist their bondage. After the war, during Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved people were attempting to build new lives as free citizens, Eliza's story was invoked in different contexts. Some community leaders used it as a cautionary tale about the psychological damage caused by slavery, arguing that the trauma of enslavement could warp people's moral judgment in ways that persisted even after emancipation. They suggested that healing from slavery would require not just legal freedom but also psychological recovery, community support, and time to rebuild damaged identities and relationships. Others saw Eliza's story as an example of the human cost of oppression, using it to argue for reparations or for land redistribution that might provide formerly enslaved people with the material resources necessary to truly start over. As Reconstruction gave way to the Jim Crow era, and the brief promise of racial equality was crushed by new forms of legal oppression, Eliza's story took on additional meanings. In a period when Black Southerners were being systematically disenfranchised, terrorized by lynch mobs, and forced into new forms of economic exploitation, the memory of someone who had struck back against her oppressors resonated powerfully, even as it also served as a reminder of the terrible costs associated with resistance. The story was told in hushed conversations, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, preserved in communities that valued oral history and understood that official records rarely captured the full truth of their experiences. The academic study of slavery, which began to develop seriously in the early 20th century, eventually discovered Eliza's case and attempted to analyze it within various theoretical frameworks. Historians debated whether her action should be classified as individual pathology or as a form of political resistance, whether it represented a unique incident or part of a broader pattern of enslaved people using poison as a weapon against their enslavers. These scholarly discussions, conducted in university seminar rooms and published in academic journals, were far removed from the lived reality of Eliza's experience. But they did serve to preserve her story and to ensure that it would not be completely forgotten as earlier generations died off. Some historians specialized in studying resistance to slavery found Eliza's case particularly interesting because it challenged simple narratives about what resistance looked like. Unlike rebellions led by figures like Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey, which involved organized groups attempting to overthrow the system through coordinated violence, Eliza's action was solitary and aimed not at liberation but at revenge. Unlike the thousands of enslaved people who fled north via the Underground Railroad, Eliza did not seek freedom for herself, but rather sought to ensure that her enslavers would pay for their cruelty. Her story did not fit neatly into categories of heroic resistance or of victimization, existing instead in an ambiguous space that forced scholars to grapple with the full complexity of enslaved people's responses to their circumstances. Anthropologists and psychologists who studied the psychological impact of extreme oppression also found Eliza's case valuable, though troubling. Her transformation from a healer who brought life into the world to a killer who ended 6 lives represented an extreme example of how trauma can fundamentally alter personality and moral reasoning. Some researchers suggested that Eliza might have been experiencing what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, that the loss of her son in her previous life had created psychological wounds that made it impossible for her to function according to normal moral codes. Others argued that framing her action as pathology missed the point, that what she did was not a symptom of mental illness but rather a rational response to circumstances that were themselves insane and immoral. The feminist scholars who emerged in the mid to late 20th century brought new perspectives to Eliza's story, examining it through the lens of gender as well as race and class. They noted that Eliza's particular vulnerability came partly from her identity as a woman and mother, that her enslavers had weaponized her maternal feelings by forcing her to nurse a white baby while her own son starved. They analyzed the ways that slavery systematically destroyed black maternal bonds, separating mothers from children, denying enslaved women any legal claim to their offspring, using reproduction as a means of increasing the enslaved population. In this context, Eliza's action could be seen not just as personal revenge, but as a rejection of a system that tried to reduce her to a breeding animal and a source of milk for white children while denying her the ability to care for her own child. Literary scholars and creative writers were drawn to Eliza's story for different reasons, seeing in it powerful dramatic material that illuminated larger themes about justice, revenge, moral complexity, and the human capacity for both good and evil. Several novels published in the late 20th and early 21st centuries featured characters inspired by Eliza, though the authors often changed details or combined her story with other historical incidents. These fictional retellings ranged from sympathetic portrayals that emphasized her suffering to more ambiguous treatments that refused to offer easy moral judgments. Some of these works sparked controversy, with critics debating whether it was appropriate to create entertainment from such a dark historical episode and whether fictional treatments risked trivializing or romanticizing violence. Plays and films exploring Eliza's story faced similar controversies. A stage production mounted in New Orleans in the 1990s attempted to present her story with historical accuracy, while also exploring its contemporary relevance to discussions about trauma, justice, and the legacy of slavery. The production was praised by some critics for its unflinching examination of difficult material and condemned by others for what they saw as an exploitation of tragedy. A documentary filmmaker who attempted to create a film about Eliza's case in the early 2000s faced the challenge that very little concrete historical evidence survived, with most of the story existing in oral traditions and fragmentary records. The resulting documentary mixed historical analysis with dramatic reenactments and interviews with scholars, creating a hybrid work that some viewers found illuminating and others criticized as speculation disguised as fact. The city of New Orleans itself has had a complicated relationship with Eliza's memory. For much of the 20th century, her story was not prominently featured in official historical narratives or tourist presentations of the city's past. The focus was instead on more palatable aspects of New Orleans history, the French and Spanish colonial periods, the jazz and Creole cultural traditions, the architectural heritage. Stories about slavery and resistance were acknowledged but not emphasized, treated as unfortunate chapters that had been overcome rather than as foundational elements that continued to shape the city's present reality. This began to change toward the end of the 20th century as civil rights movements and changes in historical scholarship created space for more honest examinations of slavery's legacy. By the early 21st century, tours focusing on African American history in New Orleans sometimes included references to Eliza's story, though guides had to navigate the challenge of presenting a mass poisoning to tourists who might be expecting more uplifting narratives of resistance and survival. Some guides chose to emphasize the context of Eliza's enslavement and the loss of her child, framing her action as a desperate response to unbearable circumstances. Others focused on the broader question of how enslaved people resisted the system, using Eliza's case as one example among many of the ways that people fought back even when they knew resistance would cost them their lives. A few guides avoided the story altogether, either because they found it too disturbing to share with tourists, or because they worried about how white visitors might respond to a narrative about black violence against a white family, even in a historical context that clearly demonstrated the violence had been provoked by extreme cruelty. The question of how to memorialize Eliza and others like her remains contested. Some activists and community members have argued for the creation of monuments or markers that would acknowledge the full history of slavery in New Orleans, including uncomfortable stories about resistance that involved violence. They point out that the city has numerous monuments to Confederate figures and to aspects of antebellum life that romanticize slavery, and they argue that there should be equivalent attention paid to the experiences of enslaved people and to their struggles for freedom and dignity. Others have questioned whether Eliza is an appropriate figure to memorialize, given that her action involved killing children, arguing that honoring her might send problematic messages about acceptable forms of resistance or might cause pain to descendants of the Beaumont family if any such descendants still exist. These debates about how to remember Eliza reflect larger national conversations about historical memory, about which stories get told and how they get told, about who has the authority to interpret the past, and for what purposes. In recent years, as American society has grappled with renewed attention to racial injustice and to slavery's ongoing legacy, Eliza's story has surfaced repeatedly in various forms of media and in public discussions. Some commentators use her case to argue that violence in response to oppression is always wrong and counterproductive, that resistance should be limited to nonviolent forms that maintain moral high ground. Others argue that judging enslaved people's choices from a position of safety and freedom represents a kind of moral arrogance, that people who have never experienced slavery cannot truly understand what it does to a person or what choices might seem reasonable or necessary under such extreme circumstances. Educational institutions teaching about slavery and resistance face similar challenges when including Eliza's story in their curricula. Teachers must find ways to present the historical facts honestly while also helping students understand the context, without either condemning Eliza absolutely or celebrating her action uncritically. The best educational approaches tend to use her story as a starting point for deeper discussions about the nature of justice, about the relationship between individual actions and systemic oppression, about the long-term psychological impacts of trauma, and about how societies remember and interpret difficult aspects of their histories. These discussions can be uncomfortable and challenging, but they also offer opportunities for students to develop more nuanced understandings of history and of human nature under extreme stress. The descendants of enslaved people, including those who may be descended from people who knew Eliza or who lived through similar experiences, carry complex relationships with her memory. For some, she represents a kind of fierce resistance that deserves recognition, even if it cannot be straightforwardly celebrated. For others, her story is primarily a tragedy, a reminder of the human cost of slavery and of how oppression destroys not just bodies but souls. Still others prefer to focus on examples of resistance that did not involve killing. Stories of escape and of community building and of survival that offer different models of strength and courage. All of these responses are valid, reflecting the reality that there is no single correct way to interpret or relate to such a complicated historical figure. As American society continues to reckon with its history of slavery and racial oppression, Eliza Monroe's story remains relevant precisely because it resists easy categorization or simple moral lessons. She was neither a straightforward hero nor a simple villain, but rather a human being who was broken by unbearable circumstances and who responded in a way that both reflects and challenges our understanding of justice, revenge, resistance, and the limits of human endurance. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what we might do in similar circumstances, about how societies create the conditions that lead to such desperate acts, about what we owe to historical truth even when that truth is disturbing and complicated. The legacy of Eliza Monroe, the enslaved nurse who poisoned an entire household to end her suffering, extends far beyond the specific facts of her case. It encompasses broader questions about memory and justice, about trauma and revenge, about the ways that systems of oppression create conditions where people must make impossible choices. Her story challenges us to think critically about how we understand resistance and about what obligations we have to remember and learn from all aspects of our history, even the parts that make us uncomfortable. It reminds us that behind every historical event are real human beings with real emotions and real suffering, and that understanding the past requires us to grapple with that humanity in all its complexity rather than reducing historical figures to simple categories of good or evil. In remembering Eliza Monroe, we honor not just her individual story, but the stories of all those who suffered under slavery and who resisted in whatever ways they could. And we commit ourselves to building a society where no one will ever again be pushed to such extremes.